is a 2002 Lamborghini Murcielago.
Yes, it is, with a gated 6-speed manual transmission and a big V12. This car came from an era when Lamborghini made ridiculous cars. This is a ridiculous car, and today I'm going to review it and show you all of its quirks and features.
Quirks and features.
Before I get started, big news, this Lamborghini Murcielago is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. Like I said, gated 6-speed manual transmission, almost completely unmodified. This is the Murci you want, and you can get it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Lamborghini Murcielago, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of the Murcielago, and I'm going to start with a little overview. So this was Lamborghini's flagship V12 model from roughly 2002 to about 2010. Now the flagship V12 Lamborghini is a big deal. It's a lineage that started with the Miura in the 1960s and continued to the Countach, two of the most iconic exotic cars of all time, and it also includes the Murcielago, which held that flagship role throughout the 2000s. Now, throughout the 1980s and 90s, Lamborghini, the company, bounced around to a lot of different owners. At one point, a Swiss guy owned Lamborghini. At one point, Chrysler owned Lamborghini. There was also an Indonesian company that owned Lamborghini called Megatech for a period in the 90s. The future was always uncertain. Lamborghini always had some new owner trying some new plan until the late 90s when Volkswagen Audi stepped in and bought Lamborghini. The Murcielago was the very first brand new model to come out under Audi's ownership of Lamborghini, and so it was a big deal. People wondered, would this car lose the Lamborghini charm, if you will, given that it had new, serious German owners? To me, the answer is absolutely not. Even though this car came out under Audi ownership, it still has a lot of the weird quirks and interesting touches that have made vintage Lamborghinis so desirable and so weird. One of those vintage Lamborghini markers is production numbers. Lamborghini made only 764 Miuras, just under 2,000 Countaches, about 3,000 Diablos, and about 4,000 Murcielagos. Contrast that with the Aventador, they made almost 12,000 units. This car has the production numbers of a low-volume, old-school vintage Lamborghini. Despite its Audi ownership trying to make more cars and more money, this is incredibly rare, and that contributes to the old school Lamborghini feel, much more like the Diablo and the Countach than the, by comparison, mass-produced Aventador. And then there's the engine. In the 1960s, Lamborghini came out with its first car, the 350 GT, which used a 3.5-liter V12. That engine was subsequently used in all future Lamborghinis: the Miura, the Countach, the Diablo, and the Murcielago. This car's engine has its roots in the 1960s. It was the same basic design carried for all those years, from the original Lambo all the way to the Murcielago, until the Aventador finally got a new engine when it came out in 2011-2012. That's another way the Murci feels like an old school Lamborghini. It still has the old school Bizzarini Lamborghini engine from back in the day, whereas the Aventador finally moved on to new newer and more modern hardware. That was probably a benefit overall, but it changed the character of the car. And again, it makes the Murci feel old school. Now, as you can imagine, the V12 evolved over the years. Initially, it was 3.5 liters. By the time this car came out, it was a 6.2 liter V12 that made about 580 horsepower. Pretty big figure. These Murcielagos all had all-wheel drive, and later in this car's production run, even more powerful versions came out using this V12. There was the LP640, which had about 630 horsepower. There was an LP650, Roadster only, which had oddly about 640 horsepower. And then there was the high-performance LP670SV, which had about 660 horsepower. Those came later. This was the original iteration of the Murcielago when it first came out with its 580 horses. As for a quirk of this powertrain, aside from the fact that it's 40 years old in this car, the firing order is printed at the base of the engine. You open up the engine cover and there it is. That was a Lamborghini signature for many years, printing the firing order of the cylinders right there on the engine, and it looks cool, looked cool in the past, and still does today. And the quirks are only just beginning. Like I said, despite Audi ownership, this still has the feel of a weird old school Lambo in a lot of ways, and let's start with the key, which at first glance just looks like a fairly normal key until you realize there's no hole drilled in the top so you can stick it on a key ring. Instead, there is a loop that goes around the center of the key, like the middle section, and that's what you're supposed to stick on your key ring. So you don't stick it on from the top like every other key, but the middle, which is rather weird. Then you walk up to the door, and the door handle isn't immediately obvious. There's a panel on an upward surface with a little circular hole. You push down on that, the rest of the door handle pops up, and then you lift from there. And of course, when you open the door in a Murcielago, you get Lambo doors, scissor doors that open up, because that's just plain cool. You can't have a Lambo without Lambo doors. Unless you have a Huracan. By the way, one other thing I like when the doors go up, the door sill has Murcielago printed, and it looks pretty cool. Not just some silver panel like most cars, but actually raised embossed lettering with, strangely, the R in lowercase. Not sure why, but it does look kind of cool, more impactful than most cars. It feels exotic. And next we move inside the Murcielago, where there are many more examples of the old school Lambo weird craziness in here. Let's start with around the shifter, a gated manual, like I said, but the strange thing is right below it you have these two arrow buttons and then four little lights labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those control the suspension stiffness. Why are they placed right next to the gear selector and left completely unlabeled? Nobody knows, but that adjusts the stiffness of the suspension in this car. Moving a little further up in the center control stack area, there's a panel that says Lamborghini. Open that panel and you have your climate controls. So you can choose between your climate controls or Lamborghini, one or the other. Now, looking at your climate controls, these are just generic climate controls that appeared in a lot of different vehicles, from standard run-of-the-mill European family cars in the 1990s, all the way up to the Pagani Zonda. It was just like an off-the-shelf supplier climate control unit that you could buy, and some manufacturers did because it was easier than creating their own. But if you don't like that fact, you can hide them behind the Lamborghini panel. Now, next to that panel, you have your cigarette lighter, which is positioned where the starter button would be in a lot of cars, but here it's the cigarette lighter because in Italian cars in the 2000s, cigarette lighter was just as important as starting the car. And speaking of strange button placement. Obviously, this car has a gated manual transmission, but if you got an automatic car, shifting into reverse was done with a little button to the left of the steering wheel. Over here, this blank button was the reverse button next to the lights, the headlights, the parking lights, the fog lights, the dome lights, and then the reverse button placed nowhere near the center of the car, the transmission selector, none of that, just over off to the side. For whatever reason, no one knows. And further on the subject of strange placement, the window switch is not this on the driver's door panel. That's the lock button. And strangely, same deal over on the passenger side. The lock button is where the window switch clearly should be. You get 2 lock buttons in this car despite only 2 doors and 2 seats instead of a central lock button in the middle. The window switches are relocated to the center. So the locks are where the window switches should be, and the windows are in the middle. Go figure. Here's another interesting thing. There's no glove box in this car, fairly common of exotic cars from this era, but there is a tremendously large sunglasses holder mounted on the ceiling. The Italians decided to prioritize sunglasses holder over glove box and storage. Now, there is some extra storage in this car. You can see there's this little pocket over here where you can keep your registration paperwork and other items that might go in a glove box. The only drawback is that's only on the passenger side. On the driver's side, that little panel has been removed and replaced with a blank that doesn't work for storage. So you do get a little storage in this car, but not where you'd want it, and a lot of it is devoted to sunglasses. And then there's the weirdness about the seat belts, which do not come from over your outside shoulder like in so many other cars. Instead, the seat belts are mounted in the middle of a Murcielago, the inside of the interior, and then you put them basically the opposite way in order to buckle them on the outside near the doors. Kind of an unusual solution. I suspect they did it like that to account for the Roadster, which wouldn't have had a great seatbelt mounting spot on the outside of the seats. But unusual placement, like so many things in this car, really does feel like an old school, strangely designed Lamborghini. And by the way, one other interesting item, the sun visor on the driver's side has a little leather strap where you can put papers or whatever you might want. On the passenger side, the sun visor has no such leather strap. So maybe that's revenge. The driver gets the leather strap, even though they don't get the little door sill storage area. The passenger gets the door sill storage, but no leather strap. Ah, Lamborghini. Now, with all that said, there is one great practical feature of this car. This button here in the center console controls the axle lifter. You'd push that, and the front end would raise up to allow the car to more easily clear like steep driveway angles, that sort of thing. These days, we take for granted that most low exotic cars have an axle lifter, but in the Murci's day, it was tremendously rare. This was one of the first cars that had it, and it was very useful. A nice nod to practicality, something that probably Audi added to make the cars more usable. Now, near the axle lifter button in the center, you see this button with a car and some arrows pointing to the sides. That controls the bat wings. You would push that, and then these little panels in back would rise up, and they looked like, well, bat wings. Murcielago is Spanish for bat, and so they played on that word and looked like wings. Apparently, they were supposed to open up for extra cooling, but it wasn't really necessary. It was really there to make you look cool. Your bat wings would go up at higher speeds or when you push that button. Now, unfortunately, they don't seem to be working on this car, which is a tremendously common issue from Murcielagos. The bat wings would fail. Like I said, it didn't really hamper the usability of the car, but it did lose you cool points. You couldn't flex your bat wings. Everybody else is raising up their spoiler. This car has bat wings. Now, the other important point, which I've mentioned now several times, and I will mention again, the gated 6-speed manual transmission. This is, I'm joking, but this is a big deal. Being able to have a V12 and shift the gears yourself. Not too many cars have that. This one does. Now, all of the early Murcielago models had a manual transmission, gated 6-speed manual. All of the O2s and maybe the 03s, but then the E-Gear automatic came out for the Murcielago, and soon after, the vast majority of these cars had the automatic transmission, and the manuals became really, really rare throughout the Murcielago's production run. Now, that's not all that surprising. The type of people who buy Lambos new or driving around flexing, they don't really want to shift gears if they even know how. But on the used market, as these cars have aged, the cars with gated 6-speed manuals have become tremendously more desirable. They're rarer, they're more fun to drive, and the E-Gear can be a little bit problematic in terms of reliability, which you largely avoid with the gated manual. This is the transmission to have. Plus, it looks pretty cool there in the center. And by the way, on the subject of more common E-Gear and less common manual Murcielago versions, you'll notice that this car is a coupe with a fixed roof. The vast majority of Murcielagos were coupes. In fact, about 3/4 were, but there was also a Roadster model with an open roof. Only about 1/4 of Murcielagos are Roadsters, and you'd think that would make them much rarer, more valuable, more desirable, but the roof situation was insane. It was this crazy top that didn't exactly just clip on. You had to like build it and stick it in place. It almost required tools, and so it's not really a car you can drive unless it's a sunny day and you know you're not going to get rained on. As a result, the Roadsters are viewed as not all that practical, and they sell for about the same money as coupes. They're not tremendously more desirable despite being rarer. Although in the Roadster you do get to hear the engine quite a bit better. I'll show you the exhaust note of this car in a little bit. And next up we move outside the Murcielago and on to the front trunk, which is shockingly large. There's a decent sized space here where you could take this car on weekend trips with some real luggage and actually transport it in this unusually big front trunk. A surprising nod to practicality for the Murcielago, although it's the only one on the outside of this car. Everything else is pure Lambo. Low, wide, exotic. This encapsulates the look of a true exotic car from the outside. It looks like a wedge, it looks like a Lamborghini, it turns heads, all the stuff you'd expect a Lambo to do, the Murci does it with a tremendously striking exterior design. Admittedly, it's a little softened compared to the Countach and the Diablo with their angular wedge designs. It has a few more curves, which was common on cars designed in the late 90s and early 2000s, but it still has the look, it still has the presence, and the low, wide, flat design. That's the Murcielago. It looks damn cool. And there's some especially cool elements on the outside. I love the headlights. The shape of them is cool, but I love how they just fit flush into the body. The front fenders, the bodywork, it just looks cool. It's like the design doesn't have to be interrupted to give you headlights. It's a neat look for this car. Now, another interesting touch on the outside, the rear view mirrors, which I remember were controversial when this car came out 20 years ago because they're wide and flat and they stick way out from the body. It doesn't really seem that controversial today, but I remember some people said, I hate how that looks. It's ugly. It's too big, too wide, comes out too far. But those are the rearview mirrors. Certainly distinctive in the Murcielago. Moving further back, the engine cover is interesting. It's a series of slats that goes over the engine, and there's nothing between them. No glass, no netting, so you can just reach right in here and grab the Murcielago's engine. Same is true for rain or anything else. Can just go right into the engine. They didn't feel it was necessary to actually cover it, which is certainly unusual, but that's the situation with this car. Also very cool on the outside of this car, the exhaust. This center exit exhaust, a distinctive Murcielago look. It's just plain cool. And this particular car has an aftermarket exhaust to, well, enhance the sound, and it certainly does that. Take a listen. Now, just in case that's a little bit too loud for you, and it may well be, this Murcielago is offered for sale with its factory exhaust as well, in case you want to switch back to something a little bit more subtle. So, with that in mind, I've walked around this car and checked out all the quirks. Let's take it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Murcielago. Woo! Wow. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Woo! I think that,
She sounds pretty good.
you know, the thing that's cool about this car, it's kind of intimidating. It's like a V12 gated manual, expensive, but then you drive it and it's like fast and fun and cool. It's kind of tossable and it's like pretty actually like approachable.
I agree.
Once you're behind the wheel.
Scarier than
Right.
the actual.
Right. It's like an old school Lambo in a lot of ways, but it kind of drives like a more reasonable modern car.
It does.
It's sort of like the best of all worlds. You don't have to get into a Diablo and like you're doing one of these to see anywhere. Oh, man.
Sounds crazy.
Listen to that. Oh,
Unreal.
it really does feel like a modern car. It's not so bad, like driving it. It's like, this is shockingly smooth. Obviously it's crazy loud because of this aftermarket exhaust, but Ivano told me the stock exhaust is included with the sale. So if you want to be a reasonable person, you can do that too. So here, let's try 6th and just sort of live it. Oh yeah,
Not bad.
it's all right. We can do this.
Yeah.
Just two guys commuting. Just drive to the train
Commuting
station.
and conversing. We can hear each other.
This is great. Or
You can do that.
it also just looks so insane. Being literally 3 times rarer than the Aventador, for a normal person, it's just a Lambo.
Right.
But like when I see an Aventador, I'm like, okay, cool. When I see one of these, I'm like, wow, like that is a special car. Yeah, one of my best friends has a Roadster, and people just lose it. Even at Cars and Coffee, where there's a lot of cool cars, it's like, wow. A Mercy. I also like how they steer and handle. It's been a little while since I drove one before this, but I drove it in like Texas Hill Country, and it was like, it was, you know, curvy, and it like does a great job with that. Again, despite the rep that this car, like you come up to it and you're like, oh, it's intimidating, it's a Lambo, it's big. It doesn't feel like that on the road. It actually feels pretty usable.
I agree. I thought for sure it was going to be more like vicious.
Yeah.
Like uncomfortable.
Right.
And like you're not really sure. You feel like you're going to spin out or whatever. This is very GT, very relaxed.
Right. Maybe this is the Lambo everybody wants. You get the looks of a crazy car,
Right.
but you can like drive like a normal car. Oh yeah. Easy rev matches too. The clutch and shifter are easy. It's so different from Countach and Diablo.
I agree.
And I'm making that comparison because, you know, Diablo only ended the year before this. Like the last year of Diablo is 01. This is an 02. Like they're actually like right now, but it's light years of difference in terms of the car. The Diablo was, as much as I love it, and I think it's an insane car, it was not, the quality level was not this.
Right.
Let's put it that way. This car is so cool. And I will say it's a lot cooler with a gated 6-speed. The E-Gear one, I drove an E-Gear one not that long ago, and it's fine. It drives well, but like, this is what you want.
Early
It's also a lot
E-gears are
smoother.
tough, dude.
Yeah.
Like when you shift and it takes a half a second. And,
Right.
You know.
Plus, they can be problematic. They can be expensive. This is just an old school, and it just feels so good. And it doesn't seem like you're going to lose value. There's a lot of interest in these cars, and
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it's waning.
Oh, you see that?
What?
A guy in the parking lot, he's sitting there with his buddy and he goes, and he starts like pointing like crazy, but the guy has coffee in his hand. He's like, what?
That's what happens when you have a Lambo.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
And so that's the Lamborghini Murcielago. This is a special car. It's over 20 years old now, and values have started to climb, just as they have with the Mura and the Countach and the Diablo. And this car deserves it. Maybe the last of the old school Lambos. Truly exciting and certainly interesting. And you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Murcielago a DougScore.
And the DougScore is here, 62 out of 100, which places the Murcielago here against other similar cars. This is the third Murcielago I've reviewed, but the first one with a gated manual transmission, which is reflected in the higher fun factor score. And this car does well against some really special cars, including some that are newer. A Murci is amazing, but a Murci with a gated manual is really amazing. It's got the old school Lambo charm with modern conveniences and performance, and it may just be the best all-around Lambo that exists.